Today we are looking at 4 cases from the 19th century. The first one is from the USA. Lena Marilla Brewster was born on the 5th of June 1877 and grew up in the countryside near the small town of Huntingdon in Chittenden County, Vermont. She was christened Lena Marilla, but everyone referred to her as Mildred. She was the youngest of 4 children, 2 boys and 2 girls, although sadly her sister died when Mildred was a child. Her father, Mr. Wesley Brewster, was a very wealthy gentleman, having amassed a fortune in farming. But Mildred's life was not easy. Her mother passed away in 1892, when Mildred was just 15 years old, and the loss seemed to profoundly affect her. She was sent away to study at Burlington High School, but upon completing her studies, she returned to her hometown of Huntingdon, where she found employment as a teacher. However, she was restless and yearned for a life of more adventure. Determined to seek new horizons, she went to Montpelier, Vermont's capital city, where she obtained work for the family of Mr. S.C. Shirtliff. In early 1896, she left his employment and went to work in a hotel in the town of Northfield, before returning to Montpelier, where she took a room in the boarding house of Mr. John F. Goodenough. She secured work as a tailor for a company named Ledden and Campbell, where she immersed herself in the craft of clothing design. While in the boarding house, she'd be visited by a young man named John Wheeler. He was originally from Canada, but had come to the city with his mother and brother, and worked as a granite cutter for the company Fraser and Bradford. A few months later, he too took a room at the boarding house. The two seemed to be quite close. However, unbeknown to Mildred, John was actually engaged to another lady named Annie Wheeler, their shared surname being merely coincidental. Miss Annie Wheeler was known in the area, not only for her beauty, but also her poise and elegance. With her radiant smile and gentle demeanour, she exuded charm that seemed to enchant all who crossed her path. She worked in domestic service in the house of Mr. C.E. Bugby, who had a large property on Liberty Street, but she had grown up in East Montpelier on her parents' farm. They were a respectable family, and although not particularly wealthy, had been described as well-to-do. John had asked Annie if she would go with him to the Decoration Day celebrations at the end of May in the nearby town of Barre, and of course, she accepted. However, when Mildred Brewster learned that Miss Wheeler would be accompanying John, she was most displeased, so much so that she decided to confront the young lady about it. On Saturday the 29th of May, she went directly to the house where Miss Wheeler lived and demanded that she release her grip on John. In a strange sort of desperate plea, Mildred told her that she was with John and that if she did not stop seeing him, she would kill him. It seemed that her words were tinged with desperation and a deep-seated fear of losing the man who she believed she loved. Although Annie knew that John was engaged to her, she listened to what Mildred had to say, especially when Mildred claimed to also be engaged to him. The 2 young women decided to walk the half-mile through the city to the boarding house of Mr. Goodenough and confront Mr. Wheeler. They walked side by side, sharing an umbrella, their conversation fraught with unspoken tension. The path led them into College Street, past the cemetery, and towards the boarding house nestled along Sibley Avenue. Suddenly, as they were very close to their destination, Mildred produced a revolver and, aiming it directly at Annie's head, fired, shooting her just below the ear. The sound of gunshots shattered the stillness of the day. As Annie fell to the ground mortally wounded, Mildred then turned the weapon on herself and fired, a desperate act born out of anguish and despair. Those who observed the unfolding tragedy swiftly gathered at the scene, among them John Wheeler and his brother. The unconscious women were taken to Mr. Goodenough's boarding house before the police and medical assistance arrived. From there, they were both transported to Heaton Hospital. Doctors tried valiantly to save Annie, but her wounds were too great, and the same afternoon, she died. Mildred was still living, but doctors were unsure if she would survive. Sheriff Bancroft went to the boarding house where Miss Brewster resided. He searched her room, and in a drawer found a broken box of cartridges and a note neatly written and signed by Miss Brewster. He read it, noting the subtle details that hinted at the emotional turmoil the young lady endured. Everything he found would be looked at as possible evidence. Mildred Brewster did regain consciousness, but when nurses attended her, she shouted, "Oh, why couldn't I have died?" Annie's body was taken to her parents' house in East Montpellier, where the funeral took place a mere few days later. The sombre occasion drew sizable crowds of mourners, paying their respects to the popular 17-year-old. Mr. John Wheeler mourned deeply. Some who knew him best wondered that if in his grief he sought solace and redemption with regret and sorrow as he confronted the consequences of his actions. The police began an investigation. It appeared that jealousy over Annie Wheeler's relationship with Mr. John Wheeler, a young man whom Mildred thought she was engaged, had driven her to commit the murder, but investigators started to unravel that there was more to 20-year-old Miss Brewster. 2 weeks prior to the shooting, she had in fact lost her position at Ledden and Campbell and had told her friends that she would be returning to Huntingdon to take up residence with her father. Witnesses recounted how Mildred had travelled to Barry to purchase the revolver and had staked out the armoury on the day preceding the shooting. It was believed that she was waiting for John's emergence from rifle practice, perhaps as she planned to shoot him. However, when he finished, he left in the company of friends, which is thought why Mildred instead retreated to the boarding house. Acquaintances of Mildred later admitted that she had confided in them her intent to harm John Wheeler, yet they brushed off her words as the fleeting frustrations of a disillusioned young woman. The case soon became a media frenzy. Mr. Wesley Brewster kept a vigil at his daughter's bedside, and doctors gave daily updates on her condition. Each one was then printed in the newspapers. Although she was conscious and speaking, medical staff had been unable to remove the bullet from her head, and doctors were unsure if she would ultimately live. If she did survive, she would face a grave accusation of premeditated murder. By the end of June, doctors announced that they believed that Miss Brewster would survive her attempted suicide. However, she stayed in hospital for many months as the police investigated the crime further, and a case was built against her for the shooting of Miss Annie Wheeler. With her trial scheduled for November 1897, her defence attorney, Mr. William A. Lord, initially entered a plea of not guilty. However, this plea was swiftly retracted as he instead challenged the indictment. His contention stemmed from the presence of a stenographer during the grand jury deliberations, which he argued was irregular and potentially detrimental to his client's case. The matter was elevated to the State Supreme Court, which convened in January 1898 to determine this critical issue. Despite Mildred's confinement to a hospital bed due to her ongoing convalescence, both legal teams agreed to conduct the session in her hospital room. Thus, from her bedside, Mildred listened attentively to the legal arguments presented before the justices. March brought forth the decision of the Supreme Court, which found no grounds to invalidate the indictment, and consequently, Mildred's trial was adjourned and rescheduled for a later date, prolonging the legal proceedings and adding to the uncertainty surrounding her fate. The trial of Mildred Brewster eventually began on the 4th of April 1898 in Montpellier. There was much public interest in the case, and the court was full. Mildred was now considered physically capable of attending court and was provided with a rocking chair in order for her to sit during the proceedings. She entered a plea of not guilty by reason of insanity. The state's argument, however, stood firm and unequivocal. Mildred Brewster was the one who pulled the trigger, with evidence suggesting meticulous planning. Her purchase of a revolver prior to the tragic event, coupled with eyewitness accounts of her practicing at the shooting range on the fateful morning, painted a compelling picture of premeditation. However, throughout the trial, the defence built a thorough case by presenting a range of testimonies that highlighted Mildred's emotional volatility and showed instances of erratic behaviour. Friends and family shared observations of her rapidly shifting moods and peculiar actions, such as isolating herself in her room and discussing her thoughts of self-harm. Additionally, They provided insights into a possible genetic predisposition to mental health issues within her family. They told the court that Mildred's maternal grandfather had taken his own life by cutting his own throat in an insane frenzy, and her maternal grandfather's brother was also declared to be insane. Two of her great aunts on her father's side ended their days in an institution, and her father's cousin named Peter Crane died in a lunatic asylum. The pivotal moment of the defence's case came with the testimony of Dr. F.W. Page, whose extensive examination of Mildred led to the conclusion, outlined in a detailed 4,000-word report, that she suffered from mental illness and was not accountable for her actions. In his conversations with Mildred, Dr. Page had gathered an insight into the turmoil within her, and contrary to the prosecution's narrative, she had revealed to him that the purchase of the revolver was not a calculated act of violence against Annie Wheeler, but rather a desperate response to the betrayal she felt from John Wheeler. She recounted how his assurances of love and commitment had fueled her hopes of marriage, only to be shattered upon discovering his impending union with another woman. This revelation of his broken promises plunged her into profound despair, driving her to contemplate drastic measures in the throes of heartbreak. This web of emotions outlined the profound impact of the young man's actions on Mildred's fragile mental state. Although John Wheeler had previously denied any romantic involvement with Mildred, testimonies from witnesses suggested a closer relationship. Mrs. Goodenough, the defendant's landlady, told the court that Mildred had a room in their boarding house, and since 1896, John Wheeler had been a frequent visitor. She believed that he used to visit Mildred at least 3 times a week. She added that she always saw them as acting love-like. However, she did say that after Mildred had returned from a visit to Huntingdon, she was very thin and pale, and when taking the sheets from the bed, she had noticed a large bloodstain on the mattress. There was also a strange odour in the room. Mrs. Goodenough went on to say that the couple argued frequently, but always seemed to make up afterwards. Mr. Juan Coyenes, a close acquaintance of both Mildred and John, revealed more details about their relationship. He recounted how John had confided in him, expressing regret over promises made to Mildred and suggesting a willingness to marry her, if not for the fact he was also with Annie Wheeler. Mr. Coyenes delicately hinted at a distressing turn of events, implying that Mildred had found herself in a difficult situation and had sought medical assistance, possibly for matters related to pregnancy. Through his testimony, he shed light on the complexities of the emotional entanglements between Mildred Brewster and John Wheeler, evoking empathy in the court for the challenges they faced amidst societal expectations and personal struggles. Mr. Warren Morse, a carpenter from Burlington, testified in court regarding his acquaintance with Miss Brewster from her school days. He recalled instances when they shared meals together, noting that while she could be agreeable and friendly at times, there were occasions when she remained silent for days on end. This observation was corroborated by Mr. Eugene Cooney, who also testified to also witnessing prolonged periods of Miss Brewster's silence, which lasted up to a week. He further described her demeanour during these times as cold, unfriendly and vacant. All of these testimonies added to the defence's claim that the defendant was indeed of unsound mind. In a poignant testimony, Mildred's father, Mr. Wesley Brewster, recounted the family history to the court. He told how Mildred was the youngest of his 4 children. He spoke of his wife's struggles with mental illness, painting a backdrop of family vulnerability to psychological challenges. Furthermore, he shared insights into Mildred's own peculiar behaviour, noting that until the age of 9, she exhibited behaviours that veered from the norm. At around 15, she suffered from frequent bouts of crying and harboured thoughts of self-harm. He went on to say that in the months he was with her in hospital, she would beg him to bring chloroform so she could end her life. Despite these distressing episodes, he recounted instances of compassion where she expressed remorse and assured him that the shooting of Miss Annie Wheeler was never her intention. This testimony provided the court with an understanding of Mildred's troubled upbringing and her internal struggles. John Wheeler gave evidence. He said that he had known Mildred Brewster for over 2 years and had regularly called on her at different boarding houses. Despite his previous statements to police, saying that he had never had a relationship with her. When questioned under oath, he admitted to being intimate with her and that this intimacy had gone on for some time. He added that he had been acquainted with Miss Wheeler before he had met Miss Brewster and had told Miss Brewster about his engagement to Annie. When asked how she reacted, he said that she was most displeased, but he added that he had never been engaged to Miss Brewster. Under cross-examination, Mr. Wheeler was asked if he knew that Miss Brewster had been with child. He said he did not. However, when pushed on the subject, he said that he knew that she had gone away, but was never sure if the reason she gave him for it was true. The defence suggested to Mr. Wheeler that Mildred found herself in a difficult situation and had sought medical assistance, possibly for matters relating to pregnancy, but the witness was evasive in his answers. The prosecution endeavoured to dispute the defence's claim that Mildred was insane by presenting witnesses who vouched for the mental stability of the Brewster family. However, despite their efforts to portray Mildred as mentally sound, the complexities of the case persisted, leaving the jury to weigh the evidence carefully in their deliberations. The trial lasted for 32 days, and when the jury was sent out to deliberate, they did so for 18 hours, before returning the following day to find the defendant, Miss Mildred Brewster, not guilty by reason of insanity. Although Mr. Wesley Brewster was unable to conceal his feelings upon hearing the verdict, Mildred received the news in the same indifferent manner that had characterised her actions throughout the trial. She was then committed to the State Asylum for the Insane at Waterbury. Mildred spent the following decade at the asylum, where assessments of her mental state from staff were inconsistent. In 1908, she briefly experienced freedom when placed in the care of a childhood friend, only to be readmitted to Waterbury shortly thereafter. Another 8 years passed in institutional care before she was granted release once more, this time under the guardianship of a nurse who had previously tended to her. With a sheriff escort, Mildred journeyed across the country to Seattle, where she resided until her death on the 27th of April 1942, at the age of 64. For case number 2, we go to England. Mary Cochrane was born in the English city of Leeds, in the English county of Yorkshire, in 1855. Her father, named Richard, worked as a greengrocer and a labourer, and her mother, named Catherine, stayed at home to look after her children. Mary's parents were originally from Ireland, but came to England in 1850 and married in Leeds the same year. In the early days of their marriage, they found themselves residing at 8 Dufton's Yard, sharing their home with fellow Irish immigrants who, like them, had left Ireland and were now determined to make their way in England. Despite facing their share of challenges, the Cochranes were steadfast in their faith as Roman Catholics, and despite struggling financially, they were considered a respectable family. Although it was not until the Education Act of 1870 was passed that all children aged between 5 and 13 were required to attend school, Mary's parents took it upon themselves to ensure that all their children received some schooling. When Mary's younger sister came into the world in 1865, Mary had already acquired the invaluable skills of reading and writing, and when her brother Michael was born in 1868, she had already begun working and contributing to her family's financial well-being. At the tender age of 15, she found herself working as a mill hand, a job both grueling and perilous for someone so young. She was, however, a good worker, which was a testament to her resilience in the face of such hardship. In 1876, she married Thomas Fitzpatrick at St. Patrick's Chapel in Leeds. Like Mary, he was from a family who had come to England from Ireland. Over the next few years, she gave birth to 2 children. Yet as the weight of motherhood settled upon Mary's shoulders, she sought solace in the numbing embrace of alcohol, and this seemed to create a shadow over her, one that appeared to grow heavier with each passing day. In 1879, the harsh consequences of her choices became undeniable, as she found herself sentenced to 7 days behind bars for her involvement in a riotous incident. The echoes of that punishment would reverberate in years to come as she faced additional sentences 4 months in prison for the theft of a flannel, and 2 more for stealing handkerchiefs. As the year 1880 unfolded, Mary's life started another chapter of turmoil. In June, she appeared before Dewsbury Borough Courts, accused of obstructing a footpath. Although a minor offence, it was another addition to her growing list of legal entanglements that always seemed to complicate her life. The court imposed a fine of 5 shillings, along with additional costs, further deepening her troubles. In June of that year, under the alias Mary Cochrane, she was again in court, this time in the city of York, as she faced conviction for a more serious offence, stealing a scarf and hat. This time, she was sentenced to 2 months in prison, but once released, she went back to her old ways. She was discovered at the scene of a robbery, and although arrested and charged, this time she was not convicted. Nevertheless, it marked the start of police supervision, and in September of 1880, she was apprehended again, this time for being a suspect person. Despite her struggles with the police, Mary managed to avoid prison for a year or more. However, the turmoil of her life had taken a toll on her marriage, and in 1881, it had unravelled completely. Her husband Thomas, having had enough of her lawless behaviour, decided to leave her and travelled across the Atlantic Ocean to start a new life in America. Following this, Mary continued with her daily routine, displaying unwavering resilience. She worked and indulged in alcohol, all the while feeling as though the watchful gaze of the law was always upon her. Nonetheless, she skillfully managed to either avoid trouble or elude capture, as over the next few months, she was never apprehended. Tuesday the 15th of August 1882 was the day of the Hunslet Festival. This quaint event was a source of simple joy and anticipation for the entire community. Children revelled in playful activities, while a brass band filled the air with merry melodies. Meanwhile, for many, the occasion provided an excuse to frequent nearby public houses and savour a leisurely day, and like most people in Hunslet, Mary joined in the celebrations. The festival took place on Penny Hill, and one young man who also took part in the festivities was named James Richardson, who attended with a friend named James Ramsden. As it was a day of celebration and merriment, James Richardson put on his best clothes, including his silver watch, his guard, and a gold chain. The hours flowed like the drinks they consumed, and as the sun dipped below the horizon, the effects of their revelry became evident. Both men were quite intoxicated. It is not known at what exact time Mary Fitzpatrick joined the festival, but she was seen with James Richardson, and as the clock neared 10:30 p.m, they both stood outside the George IV Inn. James had a drink in his hand and was standing in the dimly lit passageway, and Mary was close by. When he left, she followed him. James, unsteady on his feet and slurring his words from the alcohol, began to lean on Mary's arm. They walked along Church Streets, heading in the direction of the Hunslet Old Mill Dam. On Saturday the 19th of August, a grim discovery sent shockwaves through Hunslet. The lifeless body of a young man was found in the murky waters of the Old Mill Dam, along the River Aire. Authorities took the body to the Wellington Inn in the hope that it could be identified. Soon after, it was confirmed that the deceased was Mr. James Richardson, a 24-year-old local man who worked as a glass bottle maker. An autopsy followed that revealed some chilling findings. It indicated that his demise occurred sometime between the night of Tuesday the 15th of August, which was the night of the Hunslet Festival, and the day his body was recovered. The autopsy further confirmed that he had met his end prior to being submerged in the water. The tight-knit community was deeply shaken by the untimely passing of Mr. Richardson, a young man at just 24 years of age, who was a highly regarded employee of Hunslet Glassworks, located in South Accommodation Road. As the sombre news of his death spread, the local authorities initiated an investigation. They focused on tracing the last known movements of the deceased. In the course of their inquiries, the name Mary Fitzpatrick began to surface. They had been spotted together at 2 different public houses. One notable instance was at the Taps Public House, a venue typically reserved for working class men. Interestingly, a witness who had observed Mary at the bar informed the police that she didn't appear to be intoxicated. This raised suspicions about whether Mary's presence in the establishment was driven by motives beyond mere enjoyment, possibly with the intention of targeting a specific individual for a robbery. Later that evening, Mary had once again been seen sharing drinks with James Richardson. A waiter named Samuel Holdsworth provided a statement to the police confirming that he had witnessed Mr. Richardson and Mrs. Fitzpatrick in the passage of the George IV Inn. According to him, both were engaged in drinking, and he noted that Mrs. Fitzpatrick had followed Mr. Richardson when he departed. He said that as they made their way along Church Street, she offered him assistance. However, he could not be sure that they had been previously speaking. In a peculiar twist, the deceased man's brother, Mr. William Richardson, reported seeing him at 11:30 p.m. that same night on Barn Street, a place filled with childhood memories, as it is a street where they lived as children. This was the last known sighting of Mr. James Richardson, as he was never seen alive again. The authorities swiftly apprehended Mary. Her encounters with law enforcement were far from uncommon. During a prompt search of her property, they uncovered a pawnbroker's receipt from Thornton of Kirkgate in Leeds, which was dated for the 19th of August and was for a pledge for a gold chain. Intriguingly, she had used the alias Mary Mochin and provided the address 4 Spring Street, claiming that her husband's name was Mr. Thomas Mochin. Further investigations revealed that on the 21st of August, an unidentified woman had pawned the deceased man's watch and guard at the same pawn shop. Curiously, the following day, Mary had returned to the pawn shop, seeking additional funds against the chain, explaining that her husband had been detained and fined, which meant that she was in the need for more money. Mary, however, maintained that Mr. Richardson had given her the watch on the night of the Hunslet Festival and insisted that the circumstances surrounding her acquiring the watch, guard and chain were entirely innocent. William Richardson positively identified the items as those that had belonged to his late brother. He provided further evidence by presenting a handbook that contained the watch's serial number. William also informed the police that his brother had left the house that day wearing a gold ring and with a silk handkerchief in his pocket. Neither of these items had been located. During her initial interview, Mary inquired about the charges against her, inadvertently arising suspicion about her connection to Mr. Richardson's demise. At that point, however, she had not been formally charged and was released pending further investigations. Instead of returning home, Mary chose to go into hiding. Her escape proved to be brief, as a detective named Detective Easby successfully located her, tracking her down to the town of Hull, and on the 9th of September escorted her back to Leeds, a distance of some 70 miles. Upon her return to Hunslet, Mary was confronted with the grave charges of wilful murder and robbery. 2 days later, at Leeds Police Court, she was formally charged, where despite the emotional gravity of the situation, she entered a plea of not guilty. Recognising the intricacies of the case, the court ordered that she stayed locked up for 1 more week to allow for the collection of more evidence and the gathering of further details regarding the allegations against her. On Monday, the 18th of September, Mary appeared once again at the town hall, where this time she faced different charges, but ones that were no less severe. She was charged with wilful murder and theft of the deceased man's property. Merely 2 days later, within the solemn walls of the Leeds Town Hall, Mary faced formal charges again. These new charges now included the theft and subsequent pawning of the watch and chain, as well as wilful murder. Subsequently, an inquest took place at the Wellington Inn in Hunslet on Thursday the 26th of September. During the inquest, the Leeds Borough coroner, named Dr. Groves, noted the presence of injuries to the deceased man's head. As a result, the court agreed that a verdict of willful murder was just in connection to the death of James Richardson. Mary was then transported to Armley Prison to await her trial. The trial commenced on Saturday the 4th of November 1882 at the Yorkshire Winter Assizes in York Castle. Sir Henry Hawkins was the presiding judge, and the papers reported that he had become known as Hanging Hawkins due to his participation in numerous murder trials, of which many had concluded with him handing down the ultimate penalty, the death sentence. The evidence against Mary was by no means conclusive, but the prosecution was able to place her with James Richardson on the night he went missing. She was also seen walking with him along Church Street, and she had also pawned his watch, guard, and chain. A man named Benjamin Ryan, who had previously worked with Mr. James Richardson, told the court that he had been with him on the night of the Hunslet Festival, and they stayed together until about 10 to 10, when Mr. Ryan left the Exchange Inn to go home, and Mr. Richardson went to the George IV public house. Mr. Ryan added that he had asked James Richardson if he would like him to look after his watch and guard, as James was quite drunk. However, Mr. Ryan said that he declined the offer. Another witness, Mr. John Moon, the manager of the pawnbrokers, testified that on the 19th of August, he received a pledge from the defendant for a gold chain. He added that she told him that her name was Mary Motchen. At the end of a sensational trial, the jury found the prisoner not guilty of murder, but instead found her guilty of stealing from Mr. James Richardson. During the sentencing of Mrs. Mary Fitzpatrick, Justice Hawkins delivered a stern and grave assessment of her actions. He described her act as a daring and audacious robbery, one that had caused significant distress and harm to the victim. He added that while the exact level of violence involved remained uncertain, it was abundantly clear that she had unlawfully taken possession of the watch, guard, and chain. Justice Hawkins went on to highlight a troubling pattern in Mary's past, noting her previous felony convictions. This painted a portrait of a woman who had repeatedly engaged in unlawful activities and had demonstrated a propensity for criminal behaviour. Her criminal record was not one of isolated incidents, but rather a troubling testament to a lifestyle intertwined with common criminal activities. Emphasising the gravity of street robberies, Justice Hawkins told of the need to address such offences with a firm hand. He recognised that these crimes posed a significant threat to public safety and the well-being of the community. Therefore, he concluded that a more substantial sentence was warranted, reflecting the seriousness of her actions and the necessity to deter similar offences in the future. Consequently, Mary was sentenced to 6 years in prison. As the guards escorted her away, she called out to the gallery, crying, "Father," and lamenting, oh dear, I never stole the watch and guard." During her incarceration, Mary corresponded with family and again managed to receive news from her estranged husband. She wrote many letters, all of which persistently told of her innocence. After serving 3 years, she became eligible for release on licence, so in 1886 was transferred to the East End Refuge. A year later, she regained her freedom. At this point, her parents had already left Leeds and gone to live in America, so with the assistance of a charity, she managed to acquire passage across the Atlantic Ocean, where she was once again reunited with them. She was also reunited with her husband and children. Unfortunately, little is known about her life thereafter. No one else was ever charged in connection to the murder of James Richardson. For case number 3, we are going to Australia. Henry Louis Bertrand was born on the 26th of September 1840. His parents were Henry and Marion Lipschutz, a Jewish couple who had come to England from Belgium. When they arrived, they decided to change their name to Bertrand, as it was considered far easier to pronounce. They settled in Mayfair, a very exclusive area, which was mainly occupied by the city's more aristocratic residents, but who were now being joined by those who had gained wealth through means of business and trade, rather than family title or inheritance. Initially, life was good for them in London, but sadly in 1844, Henry Bertrand Sr. passed away at the age of just 31. 7 years later, and still tormented by grief after the loss of her husband, Marion decided to take her family to live in Australia. However, she thought it would be best that her only son Henry should stay to finish his schooling before going on to continue the family tradition and study to be a dentist. Over the following years, he studied in London, Brussels and Paris. For those who wanted to travel to Australia in the mid-19th century, the journey was long, taking up to 4 months to complete. Although some clipper ships travelling in calm seas could do this somewhat quicker, it was also possible to travel by steamship. However, due to the distance from England, these ships were not able to travel the whole journey this way. Instead, the captain would have to combine both steam and wind power in order to get the passengers to Australia. Australia had become a popular place for people to go and welcomed free settlers to its shores. Gold had been discovered in 1851, and at the same time, the economy had significantly improved. This had resulted in even more people migrating there, the majority of who were from Northern Europe. Marion settled in Melbourne and soon met a gentleman named Louis Esquil. Strangely, he too was a dentist, and the following year, in 1852, they married. Not long after the wedding, they moved to Sydney. Over the next few years, she was able to find husbands for her 3 daughters, Alice, Marion and Josephine, all of whom married well. In 1860, 19-year-old Henry decided to join his family in Australia. He thought that this would be good for him, as his stepfather wanted someone to assist in his dental practice. Henry arrived in Sydney and started to work as a dentist. He soon earned a name for himself. He would tell people that he had been the dentist for Emperor Napoleon himself. He even advertised the fact in the newspaper, the Sydney Morning Herald. He worked very hard, and after just 18 months, he ended up taking over the business. In fact, Henry's practice and popularity increased to such an extent that he moved to Wynyard Square, a far better location than the one where he had previously practiced in Hunter Street, and one where he would be able to attract more affluent patients who were in need of dental services. It was around this time that he met Miss Jane Palmer, a very nice young lady who had the reputation of being a person of unblemished character and kindly disposition. Soon after they married, and later had 2 children together. The dental practice continued to do well, and Henry was able to provide a very comfortable life for his family. One of the patients who visited his practice was a lady named Miss Maria Ellen Kinder, but who was always known by her second name, Ellen. She was from New Zealand. Her father had run a local public house in Auckland, where she had met her husband, Mr. Henry Kinder. They were married in 1860, and over the next few years, Ellen gave birth to 2 children. They then moved to Australia. Henry treated Mrs. Kinder in his practice, and although both married, they seemed to get along very well. In the following weeks, they started to see a lot more of each other. Eventually, they began an affair, with complete disregard for either of their spouses or children. Ellen was no stranger to cheating on her husband, and there were rumours that while living in New Zealand, she had conducted an improper relationship with a sheep farmer named Francis Jackson. Some even said that it was after discovering his wife's infidelity that Mr. Kinder turned to drink. By the time they arrived in Sydney, Mrs. Kinder's husband, also named Henry, was an alcoholic. He worked as a teller at the City Bank, but was experiencing very poor financial circumstances. The couple lived with their 2 children in a rented cottage in the St. Leonard's area of the city. For some reason, Henry Bertrand befriended Mr. Kinder, and the families became close. They regularly met up, and somehow this assisted in covering up the relationship between Henry and Ellen. But Henry started to become obsessed with Ellen, to the point where he was no longer willing to share her with her husband. He had been planning to divorce his wife so that the pair could be together. However, Ellen would not be able to divorce her husband, and it was very unlikely that Mr. Kinder would divorce her. This just added to his frustration, and he started to act in quite a peculiar manner. He once forced his dental assistant to row him across the harbour after midnight to spy on her. As time went on, Mr. Bertrand's obsession only intensified, and his erratic behaviour also increased. So much so that his dental assistant became concerned for his own safety, especially after Mr. Bertrand had forced him to dress up as a woman and accompany him to purchase a pistol. Following this, the assistant made sure that he was secretly armed at all times. Once he had the pistol, Henry purchased a sheep's head in order to practice shooting. Things took a mysterious twist when the ex-lover of Mrs. Kinder, a gentleman named Mr. Francis Jackson, travelled from Auckland to Sydney. Although quite shocked to learn of the gentleman's arrival, Mr. Henry Bertrand considered that this may be to his advantage. He thought that if Mr. Kinder learned that Mr. Jackson was planning to renew the relationship with his wife, he would become so jealous that he would kill him. He would then be hanged for murder, and both Ellen's ex-lover and husband would now be dead, so he and Ellen would be free to live together. However, this did not happen, and eventually Henry gave Mr. Jackson some money and instructed him to return to Auckland. Mr. Jackson agreed, but he did not actually go to New Zealand. Instead, he travelled 100 miles up the coast and stayed in the city of Maitland. By now, Mr. Henry Bertrand was getting more and more desperate. He so desired to be with Ellen, but she was married, and it was going to be difficult for him to be able to be with her. So he came up with a disturbing plan to kill Mr. Kinder and make it appear as if suicide was the cause of his death. On the 2nd of October 1865, while at the Kinder's cottage, Mr. Bertrand struck up the courage to fire a single gunshot at Mr. Kinder's head. Both his wife Jane and his mistress Ellen were present at the time. Much to Mr. Bertrand's surprise, the gunshot failed to kill Mr. Kinder and just left the poor man injured. As part of a cover-up, Mr. Bertrand then dressed the wound and sent for a doctor. A doctor and police officer arrived at the house to investigate the incident, and Henry used his convincing personality to persuade them that Mr. Kinder's financial troubles and drinking problems had taken a toll on him, and as a result, he had tried to kill himself. The authorities knew of other similar cases and believed this was probably what had happened. And of course, the gentleman's wife had been in the house, along with Mr. and Mrs. Henry Bertrand, Mr. Bertrand being a Sydney dentist with a distinguished reputation. They ruled the incident as an attempted suicide. Henry, however, was no nearer to being able to live with Ellen. His attempt to murder Mr. Kinder had failed, but he now came up with another plan. He concluded that he and Ellen would have to poison Henry Kinder. Mr. Bertrand mixed belladonna, a commonly known toxic perennial herbaceous plant, with other poisons and added it to a glass of milk. He then convinced Ellen to administer it, while her husband was still recovering from the gunshot injury. This time the plan was successful, and on the 6th of October 1865, Mr. Henry Kinder died. The coroner looked into his death, and after considering the limited evidence and the previously claimed suicide attempts, ruled that there was nothing suspicious. He wrote on the death certificate that the cause of Mr. Kinder's death was suicide. Immediately after his death, Ellen and her children moved into the Bertrands' home, but this arrangement did not last long, as her parents persuaded her to come and live with them in Bathurst, the city in New South Wales, where gold was discovered in the early 1850s that sparked the gold rush. Ellen's mother was very concerned that her daughter needed to save her reputation. Just when it appeared that Henry had got away with this most horrifying crime, he received a letter from Mr. Francis Jackson, the gentleman who had conducted an improper relationship with Ellen years earlier in New Zealand. He had not returned to Auckland and had read about the death of Mr. Henry Kinder in the newspapers. In the letter, Mr. Jackson implied that he knew that Henry had orchestrated the murder, and as a result, he would need a payment of £20 in exchange for his silence. Henry did not take the blackmail very well, and instead took the letter straight to the police. He stated that a gentleman was trying not only to blackmail him, but also to destroy his reputation. The letter was the only evidence the police needed to arrest Mr. Jackson, and at his subsequent trial, he was sentenced to 12 months of hard labour. The case had caught the attention of the press and had attracted significant public interest. There were obvious inconsistencies, and following the arrest of Mr. Francis Jackson, there was pressure on the police to further investigate exactly how Mr. Kinder had died. They discovered Mr. Henry Bertrand had kept a secret diary which contained details regarding Mr. Kinder's death. Additionally, it was discovered that Henry had boasted to his sister, Mrs. Harriet Kerr, about how he had got away with murder. Mr. Bertrand's dental assistant also provided an array of evidence to the authorities. Upon discovering all this, the police were prompted to exhume the body and conduct an autopsy. During this procedure, the pathologist found poison in Mr. Kinder's stomach. This then led to Mr. Henry and Mrs. Jane Bertrand being charged with murder and Mrs. Maria Ellen Kinder being charged as an accessory to murder. By the time the official charges were made, the news of the case had spread beyond Sydney and was being read about in newspapers all over Australia. Mr. Bertrand was being dubbed the Mad Dentist of Wynyard Square. The trial began on the 14th of February 1866 at the Sydney Central Criminal Court. The case against the two women ended up being dropped due to the lack of evidence regarding their involvement in Mr. Kinder's death. This brought massive public attention and a backlash throughout the country. There was much evidence against the defendant, most of which indicated that his motive for the horrifying crime was due to the strong passion that he felt towards Mrs. Kinder. Multiple quotations from his diary were cited during the trial to argue and confirm his guilt. His eccentric manner was also highlighted, and it was stated that he had on many occasions boasted about his success with women, his romantic adventures in Brussels, and how he had fought a duel in Paris. After the death of her husband, Mrs. Kinder had gone to live with her parents in Bathurst, and during this time had exchanged many letters with Mr. Bertrand. This confirmed without doubt that the couple were involved in an improper relationship, and along with the defendant's diary, the evidence seemed to be quite incriminating. The newspapers reported the letters, and the Australian public found great amusement in reading their content. During the trial, Henry's behaviour towards his wife was also highlighted, and it was stated that he treated her in a manner not befitting a gentleman. This included a history of violence towards her. Some reports suggested that this cruel treatment towards his wife shocked the public almost as much, if not more, than the manner in which Mr. Kinder had died. When the trial ended, Mr. Henry Louis Bertrand was found guilty of the murder of Mr. Henry Kinder, and on the 23rd of February 1866, he was sentenced to death, with the execution planned to take place the following month. Luckily for Henry, a lawyer named Julian Salomons successfully managed to get the sentence commuted to life in prison. With her husband now incarcerated, Mrs. Jane Bertrand understandably became overwhelmed with the public attention, and thus, as a result, took her children and moved to New Zealand. She settled in Auckland, as she had relations who lived there. As for Ellen, she wasted no time starting a new life for herself, and in 1867 married a man named Humphrey Minchin Carden. Henry spent time in a variety of different jails, including Darlinghurst and the lunatic asylum at Parramatta. During his time behind bars, he unexpectedly developed an artistic talent and even played the organ during chapel services. After serving 29 years in prison, he became the longest-serving prisoner in New South Wales. He was believed to have been well behaved during his time in prison, with reports indicating that he was found to have only broken one rule during his sentence. On the 17th of June 1894, the justice system declared that Mr. Henry Bertrand was no longer a threat to society, and as a result, at 53 years old, he was a free man. For the first night of freedom, he was allowed to stay at the Metropole Hotel. However, he was deported on the first available ship for England. After his release, he did not reconcile with his family, and he kept a very low profile for the remainder of his life. Although he went to jail as a popular and fashionable man, he came out quite the opposite, and rather understandably, had a completely ruined reputation. He set himself up in London, where he practiced as a surgeon and a dentist, under the name Mr. Edward Henry Burton. In 1902, Henry and his housekeeper, named Caroline Ladd, moved to Portsmouth. Caroline had been complaining, as she believed that she had been poisoned. The same year, Caroline passed away. Despite this, an inquest had found that she had died from natural causes. There was speculation that this was incorrect, and that Henry had possibly reoffended. But if this was the case, no evidence of foul play was ever found. Was this right, or did Henry reoffend? The answer to this question will likely never be known. On the 11th of September, 1924, Mr. Henry Bertrand died. He was 63 years old. For case number 4, we are going back to the USA Fanny Lillian Madison was born on the 27th of June 1863. She was the oldest of 8 children, born to Mr. Charles and Mrs. Lucy Madison, a hard-working couple who had a 100-acre farm in King William County, Virginia. Although named Fanny, everyone always called her by her second name, Lillian. Being the eldest child, she was expected to assist her mother with her younger brothers and sisters, and even though she helped as much as she was able, Lillian always seemed to have a somewhat fractious relationship with her parents. Her father had fought for the Confederate Army during the American Civil War and was quite strict with his children. He was not a wealthy gentleman and did not appear to share his daughter's opinion about the importance of an education. The Virginia Constitution of 1869 had established a statewide system of free public schools, but attendance was not compulsory and there was no standard curriculum in place. The schools in the large towns and cities did not seem to operate in the same way as the schools in the more rural areas. Lillian's mother had an aunt named Mrs. Jane Tunstall, who lived in Little Plymouth. It was agreed that Lillian could stay with her and attend public school. Everyone was already aware that she was an intelligent child, and her achievements in her local school had only confirmed this. Mrs. Tunstall was a lonely lady. She was a widow, as her husband Samuel had died in 1876. She liked having the company of her great niece, and after Lillian had studied for some time at a public school, Mrs. Tunstall thought that it would be of great benefit if she paid for her to attend the Burlington Academy. Here Lillian again proved to be an outstanding student, so the following year, Mrs. Tunstall told Lillian's mother, Mrs. Lucy Madison, that she would like to pay for Lillian to continue her studies at the academy. However, Mrs. Madison's husband, Mr. Charles Madison, said that he did not think that this was necessary. He believed that Lillian should return home so she could help with her younger brothers and sisters and assist on the farm. Lillian did return, but the relationship between her and her parents started to deteriorate even further. Things became worse when her father forbade her from writing to her great-aunt, Mrs. Jane Tunstall. Just after her 21st birthday, Lillian left the home of her parents and went to live in the house of her uncle, a gentleman named Mr. John Walker, who resided in Bath County, Virginia. Later, she took up a position as a governess in the house of a lady named Mrs. Dixon. However, this only caused more tension between herself, her parents, and her extended family, so much so that her father wrote to his brother-in-law, Mr. John Walker, expressing his displeasure that he had offered Lillian accommodation, as he believed that he and his wife knew what was best for their daughter. Lillian continued to work. She liked to socialise and was always mindful of her responsibilities. After all, she was a governess and was considered to be a respectable young lady, but Fanny Lillian Madison was concealing a dark secret. Early on Saturday the 14th of March 1885, a gentleman named Mr. Lysander Rose, who was employed as a keeper at the Marshall Reservoir in Richmond, was going about his usual duties when he saw a broken shoestring and a lady's red glove. He looked around and wondered if he may find anything else. He peered across the reservoir and could see something floating on the water. It looked like a woman's dress. He summoned help and along with some workmen pulled it out. But it was not only a dress, it was the body of a young woman, and everyone could see that she was heavily pregnant. They noticed that there was some bruising on her face, and they contacted the authorities. The coroner examined the body. He quickly determined that the young lady had drowned. He noticed that she was not wearing a wedding ring, and although there was a small tear in the sleeve of her dress, there was no real signs of a struggle. He thought that she must have been an unmarried young lady who was going to bring shame on herself and her family by giving birth to a baby out of wedlock, so instead had taken her own life. He concluded that the cause of death was suicide. But who was the young lady found in the reservoir? The police decided to put the body on display. They believed that someone would be able to identify the corpse. They lay her in the almshouse chapel, and news soon spread throughout Richmond that a young lady had recently drowned in the reservoir. Many people in the late 19th century had a morbid fascination with death. Some even sought out the macabre as a means of entertainment, and as such, thousands came to the chapel. Some with a genuine concern as a family member had gone missing, others just to look at the corpse. The body was identified to be 2 different young ladies. The police looked further into their last known whereabouts, but soon after, both appeared, and although slightly embarrassed, neither young lady had been in any great distress. It was not until 3 days later, on the 17th of March, that a lady came forward and identified the poor deceased girl lying in the chapel to be her cousin, Miss Fanny Lillian Madison. The police started to look into her background. They learned that she did not have a very good relationship with her parents and was working as a governess. They also discovered that just a few days before her body had been found in the reservoir, she had gone to the American Hotel in Richmond, where she had made a reservation under the name Miss Fanny Merton. The police thought that the circumstances surrounding the death of young Fanny Lillian Madison were quite mysterious, and the more they investigated, the more they started to believe that something more sinister had happened to her. As the police investigation continued, the coroner then changed the cause of death from suicide to murder. The newspapers had reported the story of the young lady pulled from the reservoir and about how she had been laid in the chapel in the hope that someone might identify her. But little did they know of the scandalous story that was about to follow, as the police arrested a young gentleman named Thomas Judson Cluverius, who was in fact Fanny Lily Madison's cousin. Thomas was 2 years older than Lillian, having been born on the 10th of August 1861. His upbringing was not unlike hers. He too was raised on a farm, but he was one of 3 boys, although one of his brothers had died in infancy. His parents, however, had seen the benefit of an education, and when Thomas was still quite young, he and his elder brother named William were taught by his mother's sister, a lady named Mrs. Martha Walker. Later, however, Thomas's great aunt, Mrs. Jane Tunstall, proposed that she pay for Thomas and William to go to school, and of course, Thomas's parents accepted her most generous offer. Thomas was eventually sent to a boarding school named the Aberdeen Academy, before going on to study law at Richmond College, from which he graduated in 1882. When he finished his studies, he returned to Little Plymouth and established his own law practice. He also assisted at the Baptist Church Sunday School. He was kind and considerate, and people believed him to be an upstanding member of the local community. However, the police seemed to be getting quite a bit of evidence against young Thomas Cluverius. They discovered that he had stayed at the home of his uncle, Mr. Thomas Walker, on a number of occasions during the months of July and August 1884, the same time that his cousin, Miss Fanny Lillian Madison, had been living there, and witnesses told them that they seemed to be very fond of each other. This was surprising, as not only were they cousins, but Mr. Thomas Cluverius was engaged to a young lady named Miss Nolly Bray. The police had also uncovered that on the 5th of January 1885, the couple had taken separate rooms at a local hotel in Richmond. The maid remembered Miss Lillian Madison, as when she went to tidy her room, she saw that the bed was perfectly made and had not been slept in. Witnesses had also come forward and told the police that they had seen Mr. Thomas Cluverius, along with Miss Fanny Lillian Madison, together on Friday the 13th of March. One named Dr. Thomas Stratton told them that although he did not know the people in question, a gentleman who matched the description of Mr. Cluverius had asked him if he could point them in the direction of the reservoir. Dr. Stratton added that he did not really see the young lady, but he did remember that she was quite petite and heavily pregnant. Fanny Lillian Madison was 4'11". Other witnesses claimed to have seen the couple around Richmond on the 13th of March. Items of clothing were found near the reservoir, which were later identified to have belonged to the deceased. A red shawl, a hat, and a bag were all handed over to the authorities. Police discovered that when Miss Madison had arrived back in Richmond, she had checked into the American Hotel under the name Fanny Merton. The night watchman there, a gentleman named Mr. William Tyler, told the police that Mr. Cluverius had come to the hotel very late on the 13th of March and had asked to see a lady who was staying in room 19, but he was told that the occupant had gone out. Mr. Cluverius then wrote her a note and asked that it be given to her on her return. As the occupant never returned, the note was torn up and discarded, but once it was known that the mysterious Miss Fanny Merton was in fact the young lady found dead in the reservoir, the staff pieced the torn papers together so they could find out what the young gentleman had written. The note read, "I will be there as soon as possible, so do wait for me." The police thought that Mr. Cluverius had done this in order to try and provide himself with some sort of alibi. A watch key had also been found by a hole in the fence between a graveyard and the reservoir. Investigators then learned that Mr. Cluverius had recently visited a jeweller's to replace a missing watch key. It was known that he always kept it attached to his watch chain. The police surmised that the watch key must have somehow fallen, either during a struggle with Miss Madison all while climbing through the hole in the fence. They were certain that Mr. Cluverius would have known the route from the graveyard to the reservoir, as it was often used by students from Richmond College. There were other witnesses who claimed they'd seen the couple together on the 13th of March. The police had discounted the original theory that the young lady had taken her own life, as although in the late 19th century, unmarried mothers were usually considered to be of low moral standing and were often spurned and ostracised by society, Lillian had not said goodbye to anyone. And while it would have been difficult for her, it would also have been difficult for Mr. Thomas Cluverius if it was known that he was the father of his unmarried cousin's child. The police believed that, knowing what a terrible effect it would have had on his reputation, he murdered his cousin, Miss Fanny Lillian Madison. Following his arrest, Mr. Thomas Cluverius was charged with murder. The trial began on the 13th of May 1885 and was held in the Hustings Court in Richmond. The newspapers had been reporting on the case since the body was pulled from the reservoir, and it seemed that the good people of Richmond were divided as to whether such a courteous and polite young man could be guilty of such a terrible crime. After all, no one had seen him harm her, and she was unmarried and 8 months pregnant, so maybe she had decided to take her own life. Thomas's supporters were also quick to point out that all the evidence against him was purely circumstantial. Jury selection was difficult, as everyone had read about the death of Miss Madison, and most had already decided as to whether Mr. Cluverius had murdered her. Only 6 jurors were found from Richmond. The remaining 6 were called in from the city of Alexandria, some 100 miles away. The prosecution told the court that Miss Fanny Lillian Madison had been murdered by the defendant. They believed that he had walked with her to the reservoir. There had been a struggle. He had hit her in the side of the head and thrown her into the water, where she had drowned, either because she was unconscious or her heavily pregnant condition prevented her from saving herself. They said that the theory that she had travelled from Bath County to Richmond, checked into a hotel under a false name, just to walk to the Marshall Reservoir very late at night and take her own life by jumping into the water, did not seem probable. Many witnesses were called to build the prosecution's case. One was Dr. Thomas, who had spoken to a young gentleman who he believed to have been Mr. Cluverius, walking with a heavily pregnant young lady towards a reservoir on the 13th of March. Another witness was Mr. William Tyler, the watchman at the hotel. A lady named Mary Curtis also gave evidence. She told the court that she worked as a prostitute and that the defendant had visited her many times. She said that he had been doing so since his days studying at Richmond College. Miss Curtis went on to say that on the 13th of March, she saw Mr. Thomas Cluverius in a room at the back of a Richmond cigar store. She could not identify the young lady he was with, as she was covered with a veil. She could, however, confirm that the lady was wearing a red shawl. This was significant, as other witnesses had also said that they too had seen the defendant on the 13th of March with a pregnant young lady wearing a red shawl, and a red shawl had been found near the reservoir following the discovery of Miss Madison's body. When the police had identified the deceased to be Miss Madison, they sent for her trunk, which was at her uncle's house in Bath County. One of the items found inside was a poem, which according to the prosecution had been written by Mr. Thomas Cluverius. The poem was apparently so foul that the papers would not print it, despite handwriting experts confirming that it had been written by the defendant. Thomas denied that he had written it, stating that he had never seen or heard of it until the trial began. The watch key was presented. A jeweller told the court that the previous year he had repaired a watch key for the defendant and thought it to be the same one that had been found near the reservoir. Other witnesses, including friends and colleagues, also testified that the watch key was identical to the watch key that had belonged to Thomas Cluverius. Thomas's family had hired highly recommended defence attorneys. They questioned Miss Madison's state of mind at the time of her death. Mrs. Jane Tunstall told the court that her great niece had written to her on many occasions. The letters were shown to the jury, but none were of any great consequence. But when the defence asked Mrs. Tunstall if Miss Madison had ever written to her, suggesting that she may take her own life, Mrs. Tunstall replied that she had. Mrs. Tunstall also told the court that the watch key found near the reservoir did not belong to her nephew, and produced a watch key that she herself had given to Thomas many months prior to the death of Miss Madison. William Cluverius was also questioned about the watch key. and insisted that the one found was not owned by his brother. He also told the court that on the day of the murder, Thomas was conducting family business in Richmond. Some witnesses had said that the person they had seen with the petite, heavily pregnant lady had a moustache, but the witnesses who were able to positively identify Thomas that day all said that he was clean-shaven. A hotel worker told the court that he had seen Miss Madison with two gentlemen, one considerably older and one around her age, but he could not say for sure if the younger gentleman was the defendant. Police, however, had never been able to identify the older gentleman. Other witnesses testified to the defendant's good character and previous blameless life. One said, "I look upon him, gentlemen of the jury, as one of the most correct, straightforward, and Christian young men in my whole acquaintance." Although the defence did not look to stain the deceased's character, they did mention that she had other male acquaintances, one of whom may have been the father of her child. They also told of the fractious relationship with her father and how he had previously beaten her. Friends of Miss Madison told of how she had mentioned ending her life, and a train conductor remembered Miss Madison telling him when she boarded the train that she hoped it would crash. The defence insisted that this was not the behaviour of a person who was in a sound state of mind. Every day the court was packed, and it seemed that all of the spectators had already decided that Mr. Thomas Cluverius was guilty. Thomas was unable to testify in his own defence, as at the time, the state of Virginia did not allow the accused to take the stand. The trial ended on the 4th of June, and the jury was sent out to deliberate. They returned only 40 minutes later to find the defendant, Thomas Judson Cluverius, guilty of the murder of his cousin, Miss Fanny Lillian Madison, and the judge sentenced him to death. Despite the month-long court case, it seemed that the residents of Richmond were still divided as to whether Thomas had actually committed this terrible crime. Some believed that another was guilty, others that the young lady had died by her own hand. The case was appealed to the Virginia Supreme Court. However, the verdict was upheld. Following this, a petition asking for clemency was sent to the state governor, but he refused to commute the sentence, although he did put back the execution dates. While locked up in his cell, people close to Thomas told him that if he was guilty, he needed to confess, but Thomas continued to claim that he was innocent of the crime. During his trial, Thomas had been unable to provide a credible alibi, but as his execution date approached, he claimed that he had been in the company of a young lady. When asked who she was, he replied that honour prevented him from identifying her and forcing her into publicity and shame just to save his life. On the 14th of January, 1887, Thomas Judson Cluverius was hanged. During his time in jail, Thomas had written a book entitled Cluverius, My Life, Trial and Conviction. The book was about his life and went on to cover his arrest and trial. In the book, he maintained his belief that his cousin had died by her own hand. Miss Fanny Lillian Madison was buried in the Oakwood Cemetery in Richmond. Her unborn son, who had been removed during the autopsy, was put in the coffin alongside her. Hello everyone, and thank you very much for listening, especially if you made it to the end. Please leave any comments or feedback you may have, and I hope to see you all again in the next brief case